Hi, this is Matt McCormick. I'm in the Department of Philosophy at California State University, Sacramento. This is a lecture for my Philosophy of Mind, Philosophy 153 course. And this lecture is about Frank Jackson's colorblind Mary argument. So you can think about the overall structure of what we've been doing in this course as trying to understand whether the mind can be defined theoretically, and to what extent it can be understood with a scientific or philosophical theory, how best to understand the nature of consciousness. And now that we've gotten up to late 20th century, early 21st century discussions, you can see that we've got these camps developing of philosophers on two sides of a divide. On the one side, we've seen physicalist, reductionist, materialist arguments where people like Dan Dennett, Paul Churchland, Bill Ramsey, Stitch and Garin, and the like, cognitive science people, AI people, Turing people, all hard at work, optimistic with the prospect of giving a full accounting of what a mind is. So much so that some of the optimistic AI people are even prepared to say we're going to build an artificial one based on what we understand or what we theorize about the nature of human minds. So that's the sort of yes, we can camp. And then on the other side of this divide, there's a number of prominent philosophers, just very important, very influential arguments from the last 40 or 50 years of people arguing that there's something about consciousness, there's something to the mind, there's some aspects of what we're trying to capture here that cannot be captured by a reductionist, physicalist, materialist account. Now, those aren't all the same thing always, but you can think of those as the no, we can't group. Those people are like David Chalmers, Thomas Nagel, Frank Jackson, and a few others who have presented these arguments that suggest, one way or another, that there's something that can't be captured in a scientific theory about what's going on with the inherent subjectivity, the internal phenomenal feels of experience. So Jackson's argument is one of those very famous arguments, probably one of the most influential arguments in the last 40 years. This argument's made it into movies. Watch this Deus Ex movie about the AI researcher who's trying to build a robot, and they actually do a pretty decent job of working this argument into the script, like a major Hollywood high budget movie. Okay, so this argument's had a lot of impact. So it's really important to understand some of the nuances. Okay, so as he sees it, as he understands it, Jackson says he defines physicalism. And it matters with all of these folks how we define eliminative materialism, materialism, physicalism, all that, because the arguments against, the objections they offer, can often be very pointed and very specific. So we'll use Jackson's account of physicalism and then look at Jackson's objection to that account. So as he sees it, physicalism is the view that all the knowledge that there is to have about minds is physical knowledge. All the facts are physical facts, and a complete physical account of the brain will give us all the facts about the mind. Right, so that's the view that he's opposed to. That's the one he's going to object to. We're going to get a series of arguments here against. So as a precursor, prelude to that argument, here's where Jackson's headed. Qualia is the term that philosophers in the last 40 or 50 years have sort of reduced this discussion down to. It's a way to zero in on the core of what they think can't be captured. So a qualia is a feel, a subjective, internal, phenomenal sensation. Maybe it's atomic, maybe it's just a singular, unified, pure sort of feel. That's certainly the way it's going to get treated when Dennett argues against these in one of our later lectures. But what Jackson thinks are missing is that physicalist accounts can't capture qualia adequately. I think that there are certain features of the bodily sensations, especially, but also of certain perceptual experiences, Jackson says, which no amount of purely physical information includes. Tell me everything physical there is to tell about what is going on in a living brain, the kinds of states, their functional role, that's his jab against functionalism, their relation to what goes on at other times and in other brains, and so on and so forth. And be I as clever as can be in fitting it all together, you won't have told me about the hurtfulness of pains, the itchiness of itches, pangs of jealousy, or about the characteristic experience of tasting a lemon, smelling a rose, hearing a loud noise, or seeing the sky. So you could describe all of those events neurologically, functionally. We can give you all the information you want about the physical state of the brain when those things are happening, but they won't tell you what it's like to feel them, what it is, the sensations like when you're the subject who's having it. Right? And this is very similar to Nagel's what it's like to be a bat argument that we're discussing in this module too. Okay, so Jackson gives several arguments. Call this knowledge argument 1. I think he calls it that. He describes a case of a guy, Fred. Fred has better color vision than everyone else. Now, this is the thought experiment. All these arguments are thought experiments. This is a hypothetical that the way the argument's supposed to work is he's going to describe this case that seems to be logically coherent, seems to be a possibility. And since it's possible, it reveals some gap in the physical account of knowledge. Hard to say more about thought experiments just yet, but I'll see if I can explain as we go. So he says, imagine this case of Fred, who has better color vision than everyone else. Not that implausible. And suppose he can separate tomatoes consistently into two groups that we can't tell the difference apart. So, find a double-blind experiment way to test Fred. Actually, there's some cases like this. Maybe we find some clever way to mark the tomatoes that Fred couldn't see and that we can't tell, and then mix them up and watch him separate them into the two groups. And he, lo and behold, he does it consistently over and over again. He calls his colors, oh, well, that pile of tomatoes is red 1, and that pile of tomatoes is red 2. I mean, I see why you guys call that just red, but I can see two colors there. And we come up with a way to mix it up and confound him and try to test him, and he does it over and over again, does it consistently, does better than random chance. He has statistically significant capacity to make the separation. Nobody else can see it or understand it. Now maybe we can, find some way to mark the tomatoes, but the colors aren't apparent to you or to me. He reports that those are just as different as yellow and blue are to him. Not to you, but to him they are. Turns out that there's a genetic variation that some women actually have something they call tetrachromacy, and they have 4 color receptors in their eyes instead of just 3. And I've read some reports, although they haven't been entirely clear, but it looks like there's some women who can do something like this. They're very rare. They found a couple of cases in Britain where, just like some men, 1 in 9 men are blue-gray colorblind, these women are actually got sort of amplified color vision. So the extra receptor lets them make some distinctions that other people can't. So what Jackson's describing here is not implausible. We call it a thought experiment, and we draw out these implications from it. But what he's describing is not that strange, or not impossible. Okay, so how does that present a problem? Well, it looks like Fred can see a color that the rest of us can't see, and no amount of information about his physical system could tell us what that's like. We could put him in an fMRI machine, we could analyze his brain, we could even discover that he's got some extra receptors in his eyes, or he's got some extra apparatus, or some different physiological difference or morphological difference in his brain or his visual system. You could see it in there, but that wouldn't tell you what it's like to be the guy who's having those signals come into his consciousness. None of the physical information would give you that. And that strikes Jackson as being important here. There's something about the physical system that we don't know, namely what it is to be in there, to be that system. But we know, we may suppose, everything about Fred's body, his behavior, his dispositions to behavior, and about his internal physiology, and everything about his history. Jackson just grants all of that. Just assume we know all of that stuff in relations to others that can be given in physical accounts of persons. Suppose you give, Jackson will grant. Suppose you know every single thing there is to know about Fred's physical system, you still won't know this. Okay, so we have all the physical information. Therefore, knowing all of this is not knowing everything about Fred. It follows that physicalism leaves something out. Something's wrong. Physicalism says all the facts that there are physical facts. But here's an example where all the physical facts leave out some information. So there's some facts that are missing. So it's not complete, can't be reduced, can't be exhaustive. Okay, so that was Jackson's first pass at it. That argument actually didn't get as much attention later as this argument. This argument gets everybody going, and it's very poignant. It works really well in an undergraduate philosophy of mind class to get everybody thinking about what Jackson's getting at. So he proposes, imagine we've got a brilliant neuroscientist, Mary, who, for whatever reason, we raise her, we capture her, we keep her in a black and white room, looking at black and white information, black and white television monitor. Everything in Mary's experience is black and white. So never mind the morality of doing that on a human test subject. Just imagine that somebody has that sort of phenomenal experience. But furthermore, imagine that she's brilliant. She knows, imagine it's some future state of neuroscience 50 or 100 years from now, when, this is not utterly implausible, when we've sort of completed or nearly completed all of the investigation about how the human visual system works. And Mary's smart enough to be, the world's foremost expert on understanding human vision. So we just stipulate that she specializes in neurophysiology of vision, and she acquires all the physical information there is about what goes on when we see ripe tomatoes or the sky, or use terms like red or blue or so on. So if it's a fact about the human neurophysical visual system, she knows it. She knows everything there is to know about human color vision. Okay, so here's the crucial question. Suppose we let Mary out of the room. We release her from the black and white room, or we give her a color television monitor. Question, will she learn something new or not? We let Mary out of the room and we hand her a ripe tomato. Now let's assume this wouldn't work this way, but let's assume that her visual system is fully functional. She's capable of experiencing red. She just never has. It turns out developmentally, humans don't work that way. If you had that kind of impoverished experience all your life, your brain wouldn't develop. You wouldn't have fully functioning color system. It would sort of readapt and use sort of some of that inner brain power for other things. But never mind all that. Just assume that she's got a fully operational visual system. There's actually a case similar to this in an old Oliver Sacks book, in The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, of a guy who loses his vision when he's like 3 years old, and he's blind all through adulthood, and then he gets his vision restored as an adult. And the story is about, highly recommend this book, and the story is about his trying to navigate and figure out the world and sort of ponder colors again for the first time. Now this is a little different than the Mary case, as Mary's never had any color experience. But there's some interesting insights that come out of the Oliver Sacks story. The guy's name is Joseph, I think, and he's confounded by and puzzles over spaghetti. He can't believe it looks the way it does. The colors are not what he sort of had in his mind. Okay, so the way this is supposed to be set up, and the intuition, the really powerful intuition you're supposed to have right here in answer to the question, does Mary learn something new, is Jackson wants you to go, yes, she's just learned something new. She's learned what red looks like. She's learned what the tomato experience is, and she didn't have that before. That's supposed to be pivotal in this argument. The intuition that you have. So that's why it's a thought experiment. It's like Searle's Chinese room example. We set up all of this hypothetical scenario, and then ask you this question, and you have this strong intuition as a result. Now the question is, what does that mean? You're having this intuition that yes, Mary learned something new. Now, what does that show? Does that show there's something wrong with the argument? Does it show that there's something wrong with physicalism? Or does it just show some strange feature about human intuitions? That's always sort of an open question. Jackson takes it that shows that physicalism is wrong. Your intuition should be trusted here. Okay, so alternately, suppose, and this one's even better, although it doesn't get as much attention. I think Dennett actually came up with it, or talked about it. Or alternately, if I were to hand her a banana that was painted blue, would she say, wait, I know that's not the right color. What did you do to this banana? Like, would she know that she's being fooled? Would she understand that something's wrong here? Now, by the physicalism hypothesis, yes, she would say, this banana's fishy, something's been done to it. But that seems weird. It seems like by hypothesis, were I to hand her a blue banana, she'd be none the wiser. She'd just go, oh, wow, that's apparently yellow to her, right? The mistake would not be evident to her from her abundant knowledge of physical visual systems. Okay, so Jackson takes it that this argument and the previous argument shows that Mary learned something new, and that's important. It seems just obvious, says Jackson, that's the intuition part, that she will learn something about the world and her visual experience of it, but then it's inescapable that her previous knowledge was incomplete. But by hypothesis, she had all the physical information, so that means that something's wrong with physicalism. Ergo, there is more knowledge to have than that, and physicalism, which by hypothesis was the view that all the facts are physical, is false. So it's a very direct, very focused, very clear argument. Another version, and I bring this one up because this comes up in Nagel's argument, well, what's it like to be a bat? And I talk about it at some length and talk about the problems with this argument. So Jackson also makes what he calls the modal argument. The modal argument is this: no amount of physical information about a person logically entails that he or she is conscious or feels anything at all. Now, I'll say that in a second. Hold on. That is, all of the physical facts could be the same, and yet there could be no consciousness, no mental life at all. And we'll see an argument like this with Chalmers and his zombie argument soon. Therefore, whatever it is that makes up mental life is not physical. So the implicit premise here is that if a scientific or physical explanation does not logically entail its outcomes or the conclusion, then it doesn't fully explain. And we saw this much more explicitly in Nagel's argument. And the idea here is what logical entailment means, and I talk about that more lengthy in the other argument, but logical entailment means it's as if I said, well, look, we know with certainty that all bachelors are unmarried, and Smith is a bachelor. So what follows logically? Those two sentences logically entail that Smith is unmarried. There's no way that all bachelors are unmarried could be true, and Smith is a bachelor could be true, and it not be also true that Smith is unmarried. Those have to be, that's the strongest sort of deductive validity, strongest sort of logical entailment. So Jackson seems to be assuming that a physical explanation needs to have that kind of logical entailment of its explanation, that logically Mary should have seen or understood that bananas don't look like that and tomatoes do look like that, and she would have already known that the physical knowledge that Mary had logically entailed knowledge about what red was. So you hand Mary the tomato and she goes, yeah, of course, that's what red looks like. I always knew that. She knew that before because it logically entailed. But that seems like the counterintuitive and weird result. That doesn't seem right. Okay, so see the Nagel lecture for details about why this argument and that implicit premise are problematic. I talk about it at length, and I talk about a bunch of different kinds of logical necessity there. Okay, so a redux, a bit of retelling of the argument or restating the argument. So what Jackson thinks he's shown is that if physicalism were true and we possessed all the facts about Fred and Mary, etc., then there would not be any further information to be had about what their subjective experiences are like or contain. Their information would already be in our possession. They would already know the color of bananas and tomatoes. But there is further information, knowledge about their subjective states that's missing. Therefore, physicalism doesn't capture all of it. Physicalism must be false. Okay, so the outcomes then is that Jackson thinks he's revealed or exposed, and this is one of the first arguments that does it so well, is that he's demonstrated the existence of qualia. There is an irreducible subjective feel, a what it's like is the way that Nagel puts it, to experience X that cannot be reduced to physical or even functional facts. And we'll talk about this in great length in Dennett's Quining qualia discussion. Feeling warmth or seeing red is something distinct and not identical to the physical facts about the neural events in red vision. Qualia are real. Qualia are not explained or captured by physicalist or functionalist theories of mind. So yet another conclusion here, a bit of an echo of Ned Block too, but the conclusion is that the physical accounts don't give us what we need. So we've got something new to explain. Therefore, physicalist or functionalist theories of mind neglect the most important and remarkable part of consciousness. That's the feels. Okay, so as a result, Jackson and a bunch of people who are swayed by this argument become modern property dualists, not substance dualists, but property dualists. So what's the difference between property and substance dualism? Well, instead of claiming that there are two kinds of substance in the world, the way that Descartes did, property dualists maintain that there are two essentially different kinds of property. Okay, that actually makes a big difference. It doesn't sound like much, but the idea is that we need more than the language of physics to describe brains and minds, but we may not need more than the ontology of physics. Okay, well, what does that mean? That sounds like a really abstract distinction. I think it means something like this. Ontology is about, the ontology is, well, what's the ultimate nature of reality? What's the foundation? What's the stuff in the world? What is it? So the ontology of physics is that the stuff in the world is made up of quarks and muons and leptons, and that creates, protons, and that creates, sorry, I'm getting my chemistry wrong, those are the building blocks out of which the periodic table of elements is composed, and periodic table of elements creates the compounds out of which, physical bodies are built and brains are built and so on. Okay, so that's, the ontology is that thing, standard model in physics. So ultimately, if the ontology is physics, ultimately the world is made of physical stuff, but consciousness is an irreducible phenomena that arises out of it and must be described separately. So I think one way I've put this before is I've talked about the dependency thesis. Minds are dependent on brains to exist. And I put that as my objection to Descartes. Descartes denied that. But I've argued in several places in the beginning of our course that minds, the consciousness depends on brains to happen. Jackson might well be receptive to that idea, but his claim here, and the thing he thinks he's shown, is that when physical systems of a certain sort are, composed the way brains are, and they're fully functioning brains that produce consciousness, there's a new phenomena that arises out of it, the subjectivity of consciousness. And even though that phenomena arises from the physical substrate, it can't be reduced or translated to that physical substrate. That the realm in which the consciousness lives and the feels and experiences it has ultimately depend upon physics and chemistry to produce them, but they can't be simply identified as the things in the physical ontology. So we've got two properties, but one ontology in the world. Okay, so this argument, this position actually convinced a lot of people, and many people were sort of property dualists of one sort or another, dualism comes back in this form 400 years after Descartes. Okay, so what's the relationship between brain properties and mind properties? So now Jackson worries about, okay, well, if I've now stuck with this dual property account, and I don't want to be a Cartesian dualist, because recall that Descartes had this problem that minds being inherently non-spatial and brains being inherently spatial couldn't interact. They couldn't relate to each other because there was no location where they could link up. Because if minds are in space, then now we're talking about a spatial thing, material substance. So now Jackson worries about this. Okay, now if I'm stuck with giving an account by way of these arguments of two dual properties, well, what do I say about the properties, about how they interact between the mental realm and the physical realm? Well, one position might be, and Jackson doesn't end up taking this position, but one position might be called interactionism. It might be that mental events and physical events causally influence each other. So you decide something in your mind and it makes a physical event happen, or a physical event happens and it causes a mental feel to happen. And that's sort of the unreflective way that lots of us talk and think about this. So now Jackson's put a name on it. That's called interactionism, where you've got the causal arrow going back and forth between these two realms of properties. Okay, but that's problematic, thinks Jackson. He admits right up front. One thing is they lack communality. And this is very similar to Descartes' problem. What is the mechanism, the laws, the medium, or the process whereby some fundamentally unphysical force or state is able to causally affect some other physical state? Is causal closure violated for every one of these interactions? And here's what I mean by causal closure. This is an idea from philosophy of science and physics. Causal closure is this claim that we think is true, that the physical world is causally closed. And what that means is every physical event is brought about or caused to exist by the prior physical state of affairs. So you get a physical cause that brings about a physical effect, and that creates another physical effect and another physical effect. So it's sort of like deterministic dominoes, or at least it need not be deterministic, but every event in the physical world has a physical precursor that was its cause and brought it about. Causal closure says that's all sealed up. There's no divine interventions, as it were. There's no contra-physical or supra-physical, supernatural events that reach into the physical world and then interrupt the course of physical events, or at least at this level. I mean, there are no interruptions or violations of the physical world that bring about some new chain of physical events that did not have a physical event or state at their outset. So causal closure says there's no interruptions, no violations, that the sphere of physical closure is never breached. So an example then, just to get your head around what's going on here, God's performing miracles would be violations of causal closure. And this is a dilemma that, scientists often have to deal with. So, I mean, that's what we mean when we say Jesus walked on water, or Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead, or Muhammad reached out and split the moon in two. That divine power, supernatural power, came in and interrupted and violated the course of physics and made something happen from the outside. Now, outside's a metaphor here for, supernatural. So miracles are violations of the laws of nature, and they're violations of the causal closure. So there's the problem now that Jackson's getting at. If interactionism is true about property dualism, it would seem that it stipulates, or it requires, violations of causal closure for every event that is the result of our consciously changing our minds or making a choice. It would be like, okay, so if my mental properties or my mental resolution to have tacos instead of a burrito when I choose at the restaurant, I change my mind, and then As a result, my body changes, and I point at the menu with my physical body, and I say with my physical mouth, I'll have the tacos, not the burrito. Okay, so now we just had in effect a miracle, if interactionism is true. We just had the course of the natural physical events uh, was violated, and a miracle just occurred. A miracle occurs every time I make a choice. That were a scientist watching me with a super high powerful set of equipment to diagram and understand what's going on in my brain, the scientist would not be able to say, oh, there are the physical causal precursors to the taco choice. This physicist or the neuroscientist would go, wow, that's a surprise. I didn't see that coming. And I knew all the things there were to know about the physical state of that guy's brain. So the physicist would be surprised. And that means on this account, on the interactionist account, and this is why Jackson's going to reject it, is that causal closure is being violated nonstop all day long every time I make a choice. For every word that I have uttered in this lecture, that was a violation of physics, an interruption, a miracle, but not a God miracle. It was just my mind running my body, influencing, causing physical events across the divide. So it's more or less the same. In some ways, it's similar to the problem that Descartes had. Okay, so if interactionism is true, among other things, then conservation of energy is massively violated, right? There's big problems here for physics. We can't just have all this energy being dumped into the system from nowhere, from no physical place. Um, Jackson's argument leads to the existence of extra physical facts or properties. That's the knowledge arguments that get him here. But those properties can't interact with physical properties. So he feels like he can't accept interactionism as an account of how these dual properties coexist. That leads him then towards something called epiphenomenalism, and it's going to be dissatisfying for another reason. So epiphenomenalism is this other position. It's another property dualist position that says, no, the interaction between these properties isn't two-way. It's not causally going both directions. Mental events are caused by physical events in the brain, but they have no effects upon any physical events. So mind properties emerge out of the functioning of my physical brain, and they unfold in my subjective consciousness, but nothing that happens in my subjective consciousness then in turn goes back and causes some physical event to happen. So there's no violation of causal closure. Behavior is caused by muscles that contract upon receiving neural impulses, and neural impulses are generated by input from other neurons and from sense organs. Mental events play no causal role in this process. So you keep causal closure, and the causal relationship goes only from brain to mind. These are mere epiphenomena. They're like these spin-off byproducts. They're like pollution that comes off the top of the physical functioning. Mental events, he says, are like the steam coming off a steam engine. They're not the point, they're not the purpose, they're not the center. They're just this byproduct that comes streaming out of this set of physical events, physical causes and effects. Mental phenomena are emergent, he ends up concluding, out of brain processes, which contrasts to substance dualism where minds and bodies are autonomous. So that's the position I was alluding to earlier, is that he thinks at this point, he ends up changing his mind. Jackson ends up thinking at this point that you get a certain kind of physical system together, not just any physical system will do it, but you build it the right way and get running the right sorts of neurochemical interactions, and consciousness emerges out of it. And that has this weird property of not being reducible, but it also turns out it has this weird property of not causing stuff in the physical world. One of the reasons that ends up being so dissatisfying is that it seems so contrary to our personal experience. He ends up adopting this view that says your resolve or your decision to choose the tacos had nothing to do with your choosing the tacos. That was just your feels. And those just emerge out of this train which was running, this physical train which is running on its own tracks, and it's unfolding its own way, and your feels are just there on the side, or just sprayed off the top like steam. Property dualists accept that unless there is a certain minimal level of material organization and function, there will be no minds. That's the emergent notion. Um, so, like I said, I suggested the what's dissatisfying about epiphenomenalism, and I'm not going to go into a bunch of the objections here, but what's dissatisfying about it is that it seems to leave your mental resolutions or mental decisions or your mental events as impotent to cause anything physical, and that seems like one of the most apparent, the most prominent, most obvious features of your conscious states is that you're directing, controlling, making things happen with your body. And he's ended up having to give that up as a result of this qualia argument, as a result of the colorblind Mary argument. Okay, so this unfolds in the literature for 30, 40 years, 30 years, with people going back and forth. Lots of ink been spilled on this. And ultimately, Jackson changes his mind. He ultimately retracts his view. And what he says is really interesting. Now, there's several arguments here against. Dennett ends up saying something like, well, you've grossly oversimplified what Mary's knowledge is, that to know everything there is to know is much more comprehensive and inclusive than the way you've portrayed Mary. Paul Churchland ends up arguing that there's a difference between knowledge how and knowledge that, propositional knowledge versus sort of acquaintance or capacity knowledge. So, for instance, there's a difference between you knowing knowing how to ride a bike versus knowing having all the physical propositional knowledge about how bikes are ridden. Like a physicist could know everything there is to know about riding bikes, but you hand her a bicycle for the first time and she can't ride it because that's something different. That's a knowledge by acquaintance. It's a different kind of knowledge. So what Churchland says is what Mary acquired is some knowledge how, but not knowledge that. And there was an equivocation in the original Jackson argument about how much knowledge, what sort of knowledge she had. So she was lacking some knowledge before and gained it after. So there's a bunch of back and forth in literature. And I don't recall exactly why Jackson makes this retraction, but Jackson says, however, Jackson later rejected the knowledge argument as well as other arguments against physicalism. He comes around. He says most contemporary philosophers, given a choice between going with science and going with intuitions, go with science. Although I once dissented from the majority, I have capitulated and now see the interesting issue as being where the arguments from the intuitions against physicalism, the arguments that seem so compelling, go wrong. So that's actually Jackson agreeing with the thing that I said a bit ago, is that what do you make of the colorblind Mary intuition? Do I decide that therefore physicalism must be wrong because my intuitions have got to be trusted? Or do I go, wait a minute, I feel committed to physicalism, so maybe I shouldn't trust my intuitions? And that's where Jackson goes. There's some feature about the argument that produces this feeling in us. And what's more interesting here is, why does it do that? What's the thing that leads us astray? Jackson argues that the intuition-driven arguments against physicalism, such as the knowledge argument and the zombie argument, are ultimately misleading. Okay, so he gives up on them. I won't go through some of the objections. We're going to do objections later when we look at Chalmers and Dennett. Okay, so where are we? Jackson argues that physicalism, the view that all knowledge about the mind is physical, is false. The knowledge argument, we saw a couple versions of it, shows that there are some facts, what it's like to feel X facts that are not included in the physical facts. So Jackson concludes that some sort of property dualism must be correct. Most property dualists, Jackson included at this point, reject interactionism and they accept epiphenomenalism because interactionism is crazy. That can't be right. That doesn't work. That causal closure miracle problem is too much. Jackson later took the argument to show more about misleading intuitions that can be generated by clever thought experiments than a disproof of physicalism. All right, so that's Jackson's colorblind Mary argument.